Well, if you've ever spent any amount of time watching reality TV, you might ask yourself if what you're watching is even real. The circumstances that people find themselves in on those shows seem larger than life, and honestly kind of ridiculous. My wife Mara loves watching cooking shows, and so I was watching one with her the other day, where a guy named Gordon Ramsay was going around to restaurants to try their food and to see if they're being run well. Time and time again, the servers and the cooks at those restaurants would complain to Gordon Ramsay and throw each other under the bus. That's really what reality TV is watching as people manipulate and exploit each other for their own personal gain. And so today, what we're talking about is something that almost seems like it's coming straight out of a reality TV show. Over the last 2 weeks, we've been looking at two disciples who were really great followers of Jesus. But today, we're going to look at an example of what not to do when it comes to a life of fully following Jesus. We're actually going to look at a disciple by the name of Judas, who in the end was really only looking out for himself and ended up betraying Jesus. Judas' story is so famous that in fact he's actually referenced a lot in pop culture. Anytime you see somebody who's been a betrayer to a friend or family member, a lot of times they might be called Judas as an accusation. That's also probably why you don't have many friends at school running around with the name Judas. So let's dig into who Judas was as a disciple and a follower of Jesus, and begin to look at what happened with Judas and how we can learn from his situation today. One of the references to Judas that helps give us a bit of insight into who he is found in John chapter 12, verses 4 through 6. And it gives us a picture of Judas's character. At this point, Jesus just had some expensive perfume poured on his feet by Mary, one of Jesus' followers. Judas Iscariot, the disciple who would soon betray him, said, "That perfume is worth a year's wages. It should have been sold and the money given to the poor." Not that he cared for the poor, he was a thief, and since he was in charge of the disciples' money, he often stole some for himself. At the point that this passage occurs, Judas would have been with Jesus for just a few years and would have had the opportunity to hear Jesus teach and watch him heal the sick. He knew Jesus' heart for caring for the poor, and he would have been taught how Jesus wanted his followers to live the same way, by caring for the poor. But we learn that even though Judas could say good things about helping the poor, his heart was never really in it. Maybe some of you can relate to that. I know I can. Looking back over the years, there's been some days where I come to church because my parents wanted me to, or because I felt like I had to, not necessarily because I wanted to. My heart wasn't really in it. And so for Judas, he seemed to care way more for himself. And he was more interested in what he could have gotten out of this from the perfume than what could have been given to the poor. It's also important to notice that Judas seemed to have this habit of stealing from the disciples. This wasn't a one-time mistake that he made, but a continuous decision to take advantage of others for his own gain. Judas in this passage shows that even though he had been with Jesus and heard his teaching for years, he hadn't really allowed what Jesus was teaching to actually affect him or change him in the inside. To put it this way, Judas knew a lot about Jesus, but he hadn't really committed to following him in any way. And Jesus knew what was going on in Judas's heart and in his mind, but he kept him around anyway. In fact, later in John chapter 13, he ends up washing Judas's feet and showing him a great act of care and love, even though he knew in that very moment Judas was planning to betray him. Jesus' response to Judas shows us something so important. We decide whether we will follow Jesus. Jesus gives Judas the same treatment that he does all of the other disciples. He taught him the same, he showed him many of the same miracles, but Judas couldn't get past seeing his own selfishness to get to a place where what Jesus was saying could make any difference in his life. Judas seemed to be more interested in what he could gain from following Jesus than what he could give. And this is a big problem for wanting to follow Jesus, because following Jesus is truly about giving him everything that we have. Because Jesus doesn't just want us to know about him, he wants our everything. Jesus desires a relationship with us that is about us living a life fully following and fully loving him and loving others around us. So much so that he opens his most famous sermon with words that say that those who put other people first and care for those who are lowly and outsiders will be the most blessed. The only way that we can live that way is if we trust Jesus with every part of us. Our family, our friends, what college we would go to, what job we will have. Jesus wants us to follow him with all of it. And Judas didn't and he couldn't see that. He was too wrapped up in what he wanted to see. That what Jesus wanted was far better than any money or possession he could gain. And years of this thinking allowed Judas to spiral into a place where he couldn't even see the picture Jesus was painting for his disciples anymore. And he made a decision to do what was best for him. Judas ends up going on to betray Jesus, and Jesus is put to death, all in exchange for a pretty large payment. Judas ends up regretting his decision, and he misses out on what's about to come. When Judas leaves to betray Jesus, Jesus tells the rest of the disciples about how he is going to be put to death. But through his death and resurrection, he will bring new life to those who believe and follow him. Jesus used the betrayal of Judas, and he is put to death, bringing all of mankind's sin with him. He is buried, and then he is raised to life on the third day, bringing the gift of new life with him for all those who will believe in him. Guys, that's where we come in. Judas couldn't see that big picture, but we have the benefit of looking back and learning from what Judas didn't see. Do you want a life of just knowing about Jesus or of fully following Jesus? Because if you choose following Jesus, you will find that your life becomes one that makes a difference. It brings back hope and life to the people around you as the things that Jesus teaches us begin to change us from the inside out. And if you choose a life of just knowing about Jesus, you will miss out on the amazing world-changing things that he wants to call you to. And all of us can be on the lookout for where we might let our own selfishness get in the way of seeing what Jesus really wants us to do in our lives. And I believe that if we get this right, if we can keep the thoughts of, what do I get out of this at bay, we can really change the world. We can see hope restored in the world and becoming a better place as Jesus uses us to impact the world far beyond our wildest, most selfish dreams could imagine. So, what are you going to make of Judas's story? Do you need to trust Jesus completely? Is it time that you say, Jesus, I'm going to give you my everything, and not just be satisfied for knowing a story about you? I want you to give me a life where I can bring the kind of change that you did when you lived here on the earth. Man, be asking yourselves these kind of questions. In fact, I'd love for you to take a moment right now to reflect and write down, where are you struggling with fully following Jesus? Is it maybe your time, your friends, maybe your relationships? Maybe it's struggling with anger, anxiety, or stress. Where do you need to give Jesus your everything?